Hello, my friends. You may recall that some weeks ago, President Trump quipped that maybe Russia is a paper tiger. If you truly believe Russia is a paper tiger, then it becomes easy to say, fine, we'll just do whatever we want. That attitude helps explain why Western Europeans keep acting as if time is on their side. They talk as though Russia is weak, collapsing, and only barely advancing. You can hear this clearly in the way NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte frames the war. He mocks the Russian military, stresses that Russia has gained only about 1% of Ukrainian territory this year, claims they are taking only a few yards a day, says they have spent 18 months trying to seize Pokrovsk without fully succeeding, and insists they are losing 20,000 men a month. He adds that Putin is raising taxes and says you do that only when you have no alternative, so Russia must be in a bad place, yet in the same breath he says we can't wait him out. And that is double speak. If Russia is truly in a bad place, then waiting them out is exactly what you would do. If Russia is not in a bad place, then you can't wait them out. You can't have it both ways. And when Rutte mentions Pokrovsk as proof of Russian weakness, the map and the battlefield reality say something else. Every time I show the Pokrovsk-Mirnograd area, there is less and less Ukrainian-controlled ground. Mirnograd is almost entirely eaten away. Red and gray zones expand steadily. Yes, it has taken Russia a long time, but how many Ukrainian soldiers have died defending that ground? This is where Western framing keeps failing. The Russian objective is not raw territorial acquisition for its own sake. Territory is a byproduct of the real objective, the systematic destruction of Ukrainian armed forces. That's why they prioritize firepower over speed. They minimize their own losses and maximize Ukrainian losses. Whether it took 18 months or 18 weeks to grind down, Pokrovsk doesn't change the outcome. We've seen the same pattern over and over. Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Mariupol, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, the Kursk incursion, the Krinky attack on the Dnipro each time the Russian military destroys Ukrainian formations and the territory follows. That is the common theme, and it's been consistent for nearly 3 years. Yet many in the West keep talking as if the only way out of the war is Russia leaving Ukraine and Ukraine winning a total military victory. That is a dystopian view because it ignores the battlefield trajectory. If you insist on a Ukrainian victory, that cannot happen, then what you are really doing is condemning Ukraine to fight until there is no one left to fight. The fight to the last Ukrainian slogan is not a caricature anymore, it is policy in plain sight. Part of the problem is a gross Western misunderstanding of modern warfare. About a week ago, a report circulated through the BBC's Ukraine service described Ukrainian trainees at Polish and Czech training grounds saying NATO manuals no longer work. The report described a training exercise from last month. Ukrainian troops were surprised to see scenarios in which an APC crosses a river. The Ukrainians told the instructors bluntly that any equipment would be destroyed by drones long before reaching the shore. Then the exercise continued. Czech paratroopers played the attacking force, Ukrainians played defense. As the Czech troops formed attack columns and advanced, the Ukrainians simply launched Mavic drones. The attackers were immediately detected. After the first attempt, the Czech instructor stopped the scenario and asked if the Mavics could be taken out, not because that reflects reality, but because without removing drones, the training became impossible. The Ukrainians essentially replied, in real war, you don't get to ask drones to step aside. You'd be dead before you reach the river line. That is everyday reality on the Russia-Ukraine front. I want to underline how shocking that is. We're nearly 4 years into this war. We're 5 to 6 years past the Armenia-Azerbaijan war, where drones devastated armor. Drone-centric combat has been visible to the entire world for years. Yet NATO training is still being run as if the drone environment is optional. If this is how they train Ukrainians, what does that say about how they train their own forces? These are the people Europe wants to base its security on. If Europe is dysfunctional at the political and diplomatic level, which is obvious, this suggests dysfunction at the tactical and doctrinal level too. Meanwhile, Russia is doing the opposite. Russia adapted. It is continuing to expand drone use in multiple layers, integrating electronic warfare, glide bombs, artillery innovations, and long-range strike systems. Russia does not sit still. It refines its doctrine to preserve its manpower and multiply Ukrainian losses. Ukraine cannot catch up to that trend, especially with its shrinking manpower base and dependency on Western supply chains. Still, European and Ukrainian leaders act as if they can set the conditions regardless of what Russia says and regardless of what the battlefield is proving. That's why Zelensky's speeches may sound inspiring to people who don't follow the front lines, but in strategic terms, they are catastrophic. If you keep clinging to the narrative of inevitable victory, all you do is add to Ukraine's body count and enlarge the final bill of defeat. The war is already decided. The only variable left is the final toll. How many more people die? How much more territory is lost? How many more towns and cities are destroyed? Another variable, a dangerous one, is whether the war expands beyond Ukraine or draws NATO into direct conflict with Russia. I pray that even delusional leaders are not suicidal enough to push Europe toward a war that could go nuclear. The least bad option is to recognize the loss, spin it politically if they must, but stop before dragging the rest of Europe or the U.S. into direct war. So whatever comes out of Geneva, whatever Rubio says next, whatever Europeans try to force back onto the table, the realities remain unchanged. Russia holds the battlefield momentum, and it has no incentive to accept a settlement that abandons its core war aims. Any negotiated outcome that does not meet those aims will simply be taken by force. No major power in history has ever walked away from victory when it had the ability to compel compliance, and Russia will not be the first. I will begin by grounding the entire analysis in one central truth. There is a complete disconnect between the material reality of the battlefield and the fantasy-based political language of the West. What we are witnessing now, both in Ukraine's collapsing front lines and inside the negotiations happening between Kyiv, Washington, and various European capitals, is the slow but inevitable collision between these two worlds. And only one of them can survive. Reality always prevails. And in this conflict, Russia is the only actor operating fully inside reality. Russia is the only rational actor in the conflict. For more than 3 years, Russia has avoided self-delusion. Moscow did not sugarcoat its objectives, did not drown itself in ideological dream talk, and never entertained the illusion that Western powers could be trusted to honor agreements. Russia identified its strategic aims with absolute clarity: neutralization of Ukraine as an armed NATO outpost, destruction of the Ukrainian military apparatus built by the West, securing Russia's borders and long-term strategic depth, protecting the population of Donbass and the Russian-speaking regions, forcing the West to acknowledge new geopolitical realities. These goals were not performative, they were not PR, they were not flexible. They represented the minimum conditions required for Russia to feel secure in a region where NATO had relentlessly expanded for 30 years. And unlike Western governments whose strategies shift weekly, Russia has not deviated even once. This disciplined consistency is why Moscow's position today is stronger than at any point since the beginning of the conflict. Western governments are operating inside a fiction. The Western political class continues to recite mantras that no longer have any connection to reality. Borders cannot be changed by force, and Ukraine must choose its European destiny. Ukraine must have unlimited military guarantees. Ukraine will join NATO and the EU. Russia must withdraw and accept Western oversight. None of this has any alignment with the battlefield. These statements are ideological fantasies maintained to reassure Western publics who are increasingly skeptical, exhausted, and unprepared for the truth. Ukraine has lost the war militarily, economically, demographically, and strategically. And the only remaining question is not whether Ukraine loses, but how much is left of Ukraine when the war ends. Western elites cannot admit this because it would collapse their political credibility at home. So they continue repeating slogans as if repetition will create victory. It will not. The collapse of the Ukrainian front lines, while politicians talk, the battlefield decides. In recent days, Russian forces have broken Ukrainian resistance in the Kupiansk direction, entered Huliapol in Zaporizhia, pushed deeper around Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, advanced steadily in the north, center, and south of the contact line. This is not a temporary setback. It is the continuation of a clear pattern seen in Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Soledar, Lysychansk, Severodonetsk, Marinka, Vuhledar, the Dnipro riverbank operations, the Kursk incursion counter operations. Every single major engagement follows the same logic. Russia destroys the Ukrainian military first and captures terrain second. Territory is a byproduct. The destruction of enemy manpower is the strategic priority. This is why Russia has been patient. This is why Russia has avoided unnecessary risks. This is why Russia methodically grinds down the Ukrainian armed forces at a ratio that Ukraine cannot sustain. The Western narrative ridiculing Russian advances as slow has aged terribly. What Western analysts called slow, Russian commanders called minimizing losses, and the negotiations in Geneva a charade without Russia. Even as Ukraine's army collapses, Western officials are desperately trying to craft a peace plan without Russia's participation. In Geneva, the United States, represented by Rubio, is attempting to force a document onto Ukraine that can later be forced onto Russia. Russia has already dismissed this as meaningless. PESCO stated clearly, Russia is not negotiating with the U.S. Russia received no request for negotiations. Russia is not preparing for talks. This means everything happening in Geneva is theater. Ukraine's chief negotiator, Yermak, a former entertainment lawyer, sits with Rubio rewriting Trump's 28-point plan. Ukrainian media complains that no breakthroughs were achieved because Ukraine refuses any limitation on army size, any withdrawal from Donbass, any concessions on NATO, any recognition of Russian control over territory. Ukraine is demanding things that only a victorious power can demand. But Ukraine is not victorious. Ukraine is collapsing, yet its leadership cannot publicly concede anything because their internal narrative is built entirely on Western promises. They cannot break from that fantasy without destroying their own legitimacy. This is why the Geneva talks are fundamentally doomed. The European peace plan, surrender disguised as diplomacy. The recently leaked European plan resembles Trump's framework, but with more ideological posturing and even less realism. It demands Russia accept permanent limits. Russia surrender strategic gains. Ukraine join the EU. Ukraine join NATO or receive NATO equivalent guarantees. Russia accept a demilitarized zone. Russia accept monitoring by Western institutions. In other words, the plan is a request for Russian capitulation, yet Europe offers nothing in return. No security guarantees, no lifting of sanctions, no recognition of Russian interests, nothing except a list of demands. It is straightforward and completely detached from reality. Europe wants the war to continue, not because Ukraine can win, but because European politicians cannot survive the political fallout of admitting defeat. The United States wants to freeze the conflict. Here is the key difference I must highlight. Europe wants the war to continue. Ukraine wants the money to continue. The United States wants the bleeding to stop before a full collapse humiliates Washington. The Trump team recognizes the danger. The Ukrainian army is disintegrating. Europe cannot handle millions more refugees. NATO risks appearing militarily irrelevant. A complete defeat would strengthen Russia and weaken U.S. influence globally. Thus, the U.S. goal is not peace. It is not justice. It is not stability. The U.S. goal is to freeze the line as soon as possible, to preserve a narrative of compromise rather than defeat. But even this may be too late. No need to hurry, no need to concede. Russia has zero incentive to accept any Western plan. Why? Because Russia has momentum on the battlefield. Russia has stable domestic support. The Russian economy is outperforming Europe. Sanctions have failed. Ukraine is running out of men, weapons, energy, and territory. NATO is not prepared to intervene. Western unity is fracturing. Russia's military industrial capacity is expanding rapidly. Russia sees strategic advantage in finishing the job. If Russia accepted a ceasefire now, it would be choosing to stop winning. No rational great power would do this, and Russia is acting rationally. Thus, Putin can simply wait. The longer the war continues, the weaker Ukraine becomes, the weaker NATO looks, the more fractured Europe becomes. The more Russia can dictate terms later Every month that passes favors Russia. Buy. A self-inflicted disaster. European politicians continue announcing new sanctions as if repetition equals success. Scott Besson pointed out that after 19 failed sanctions packages, logic would dictate a change of strategy. But Europe is preparing package number 20. This is delusion. Sanctions have strengthened Russia's industrial base, diversified Russian trade, forced Russian technological development, harmed European economies more than Russia's, driven global energy markets toward non-Western alliances, pushed Russia closer to Asia and BRICS, exposed the fragility of Europe's energy dependence. Europe is boiling itself, not Russia. The idea that Russia will collapse because of sanctions has been destroyed by reality. Yet, European elites cling to it because admitting failure would destroy their credibility. Russia, meanwhile, continues growing militarily, economically, and diplomatically. The absurdity of G7, G8, incentives for Russia. Western negotiators are floating the idea of inviting Russia back to the G8, and this is not an incentive. It is a misunderstanding of how Russia thinks. Russia does not need Western approval. Western clubs, Western financial institutions, Western oversight, Western integration. Russia has built its own system with BRICS Plus, the Eurasian Economic Union, the SCO, and deep ties with China, India, Iran, and the Global South. Returning to the G7 would be a downgrade. Western policymakers are still living in 1998. The world has changed. They have not. Europe's internal political crisis. Europe, unlike Russia, is politically unstable. Germany is facing deindustrialization. France is collapsing socially and politically. The UK is directionless. Poland is at odds with both Germany and Ukraine. The Baltics are panicking. Italy is resisting economic suicide. European voters are losing faith in leadership. This internal fragmentation explains why Europe keeps shouting maximalist demands. It is a survival mechanism for politicians who have nothing left but rhetoric. The next and most overlooked element in this conflict is that Russia is no longer operating as a country under pressure, but as a country with strategic freedom. Western politicians continue speaking as though Moscow is cornered, isolated, or desperate for a diplomatic exit. This narrative is used to reassure Western populations it has no basis in reality. Russia is not the actor scrambling for a way out. Russia is the actor shaping the timeline. This is precisely why the Western political structure is beginning to unravel. The entire diplomatic posture of Europe and the United States was built on an assumption that Russia would bend under pressure, that Moscow would negotiate from weakness, and that sanctions would force political fragmentation inside Russia. Instead, the opposite occurred. The Russian state consolidated, public support for the government increased, industrial output surged. The military adapted faster than NATO expected. Meanwhile, Western cohesion is weakening, not Russia's. A simple but uncomfortable truth emerges from this. Russia can afford time. The West cannot. The longer the conflict continues, the more strategic advantage Russia accumulates. Ukraine becomes more dependent, more hollowed out, and more drained of manpower. Europe becomes more burdened with economic strain, energy crises, and political instability. The United States becomes more exposed as its credibility erodes. Time is a strategic asset, and only Russia possesses it. This new balance of time and pressure explains why the current Western attempt to craft peace frameworks rings hollow. These frameworks are not being created because the West is strong. They are being created because the West recognizes the ground is shifting beneath its feet. What Western leaders fear most is not the continuation of the war. What they fear is the end of the war, because the final outcome will reveal the scale of the defeat. That is why the negotiations in Geneva are so frantic, so confused, and so contradictory. Western diplomats are trying to freeze the conflict before the Ukrainian front collapses entirely. Yet they simultaneously insist on terms that only a victorious Ukraine could demand. The contradiction is obvious. They want to stop losing, but they refuse to acknowledge they have already lost in military terms. Russia sees this contradiction clearly. Moscow understands that these plans, whether drafted in Washington, Brussels, or Ukrainian offices, are not peace proposals. They are political damage control devices designed to save reputations, not lives. The proposals attempt to preserve the narrative that the West remains in control of the situation. But structurally, the West has lost all control on the battlefield, and they are now writing political text to obscure that fact. This is why Russia does not engage with these frameworks. They are built on illusions. The most revealing detail is that the West is negotiating without Russia. That alone demonstrates how detached from reality Western diplomacy has become. They are crafting settlement terms for a war that Russia is winning without including Russia in the room. It would be like drafting surrender conditions for the United States during World War II without inviting Washington. It is absurd on its face. This diplomatic theater may serve internal political purposes in Europe and the United States, but it has no strategic value. When Russia eventually does respond, Moscow will not be responding to a Western text. Russia will be responding to facts on the ground. The battlefield dictates the terms, not the other way around. And when one evaluates the battlefield, the pattern is unmistakable. The Ukrainian military has been subjected to systematic attrition that no armed force in Europe could endure. Russia's methodical destruction of Ukraine's brigades, artillery, air defense, logistics hubs, and command structures is deliberate. Western analysts mocked Russia for its slow pace. In reality, Russia was pacing its operations around the preservation of manpower and the optimization of fire superiority. The goal was never speed. The goal was certainty. That certainty has now arrived. Ukrainian positions across multiple fronts are cracking. Russian advances, once mocked as incremental, are now accelerating as Ukrainian defenses thin out. Western trained brigades have been wiped out. Ammunition stockpiles are depleted, air defenses are failing, morale is deteriorating. Yet Western leaders continue to speak in the language of triumphalism, insisting that Ukraine will determine its European destiny, that its borders are inviolable, that its sovereignty will be restored, and that Russia will be compelled to retreat. These statements are not policies. They are psychological coping mechanisms. Inside Russia, the interpretation is simple. The West is negotiating with itself, not with Moscow. Europe drafts a plan. The United States drafts a competing plan. Ukraine rejects elements of both. Then all parties pretend that Russia will choose between them. But Russia has no stake in these internal Western conversations. Moscow will define the conditions of settlement when and if it sees strategic value in doing so, not before. The irony is that while the West continues speaking in the language of ideals, Russia continues acting in the language of power. Russia's military-industrial mobilization has outpaced NATO expectations by years. Its economy has surpassed pre-war growth levels. Its global partnerships have expanded across Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. Sanctions intended to isolate Russia accomplished the opposite. They forced Russia to reorganize its economy in ways that made it more resilient and less dependent on Western systems. Europe, meanwhile, finds itself trapped in an energy crisis of its own making, with industries shutting down, inflation rising, and public trust collapsing. This is why European leaders cling so aggressively to the narrative that Ukraine is fighting for Europe. They must keep the moral storyline alive because the material storyline is deteriorating rapidly. Here lies the core geopolitical divide. Russia is acting like a great power, while the West is pretending to act like one. Western governments speak about principles, but principles do not halt artillery, intercept missiles, or stabilize collapsing armies. Russia, in contrast, has pursued its objectives through state capacity, long-term planning, and pragmatic alliances. Even critics in the global South acknowledge that Russia has executed its strategy with far more consistency than NATO. The Western political class still insists that Ukraine will join NATO and the EU, but they cannot even guarantee the country's ability to survive the next 6 months on the battlefield. They speak of reconstruction, yet Ukraine's infrastructure is collapsing faster than Western money can repair it. They speak of security guarantees, yet they cannot even guarantee ammunition shipments on schedule. They speak of sovereignty, yet Ukraine is dependent on external financing and foreign decision makers. From Moscow's perspective, these contradictions are not signs of Western principle, but signs of Western weakness. And it is precisely because of this weakness that Russia sees no reason to negotiate now. Russia does not negotiate from strength until strength has achieved its maximum leverage. That moment has not yet arrived. If anything, Russia perceives that the coming months will yield even greater strategic opportunity. Deeper Ukrainian collapse, sharper political fragmentation in Europe, and increasing disunity within the American establishment as competing factions debate how to explain the failure. Russia's patience is not passivity. It is strategy, and that strategy is working.